Well, I think we're going to begin our session today. Good afternoon to everybody. My name is Glenn Osaki. I'll be your host today. I serve as the senior advisor to President Carol Folt in the area of international communications and marketing. Our director, Jay Wang, sends his regards, but unfortunately wasn't able to join us today. But we are very pleased to have for you a wonderful session today in this conversation with the Singapore ambassador. Before we begin, I just wanted to mention that we'll be taking questions from the audience, and shortly Ambassador Mirpuri will be sharing some remarks. But before he does that, I would like to introduce a few of our distinguished guests that are here with us today. First of all, I'd like to introduce the Consul General of Singapore in San Francisco, Mr. William Schick. We also have with us the First Secretary Political at the Embassy of Singapore to the U.S., Mr. J.J. Fang. We're also pleased this afternoon to have with us the Consul General of Thailand, Mr. Tor Saralamba. And then we also have with us today the CPD Advisory Board member, Ms. Marie Royce. And then finally, I'm very pleased to welcome a very good friend, Mr. Charles Chip Zukowski. Chip is a professor of chemical engineering and material science here at USC, and previously served as our distinguished provost for 3 years. So welcome to all of you to the session today. I will beg for some forgiveness. You might tell that my voice is a little bit scratchy. It's a case of seasonal allergies, which seem to be really acting up this year. But I think I will get through this session, and I certainly did not want to miss it. It's really a unique opportunity to be able to hear from really somebody who has a perspective of foreign relations and diplomacy that is almost unlike many in the world, and I'll let him share in a minute. But let me begin by introducing Mr. Ambassador Ashok Kumar Mirpuri. He took up his appointment as Singapore's ambassador to the United States in July of 2012. Ambassador Mirpuri previously had served as ambassador to Indonesia from 2006 to 2012. He was also the High Commissioner to Malaysia from 2002 to 2006, and also served as High Commissioner to Australia from 2000 to 2002. In addition to a very distinguished career in public policy, Ambassador Mirpuri graduated with honors degree from the National University of Singapore. He also received a master's from the University of London School of Oriental and African Studies as a Raffles Scholar. And he also attended the program for executive development at the Institute for Management Development in Switzerland, and also has an advanced management program from Harvard here in the US. So Ambassador Mirpuri, I'd like to turn the floor over to you to share some opening remarks. And then I have a few questions that have come in already that I will pose, and we also encourage our audience that's here in the room, as well as those of you that are watching online, to insert questions into the chat, and those will be fed to me as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn, and thank you for the invitation to the Center for Public Diplomacy for inviting me here. If I had known there was a Center of Public Diplomacy, I would have come and done my graduate work over here. Because given my role as a diplomat, I've been in diplomatic service for almost 40 years, public diplomacy has become more and more important. In the old world of diplomacy that I started in the 1980s, we wanted to keep foreign policy opaque. We didn't want people to ask us questions. We wanted to keep it in small rooms where people didn't really sort of get involved. Today, and particularly the 11 years I've been here in Washington, in the United States, public diplomacy has become top of sort of everything that I do, everything that my colleagues do. In Washington, D.C., most of the ambassadors are very active in it. So it's really turning around this world in which it's communicate, 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 and how do you communicate effectively? So what actually I'll try and do today, sort of peel apart some of the things that I've had to do as an ambassador in Washington over the past 11 years, because it is fairly unique in terms of how you operate. Yes. And I've subtitled what I'm going to be talking about for a country like Singapore. It's being heard above the din, because we're a small country, and how do you get people to hear your message with all the other noise going on, with everything else going on? And, you know, from the perspective of the embassy in particular, it's so important for us to be part of that conversation, because if you are not, you're sort of put aside in many ways. First, for a country like Singapore, and many of you may not be very familiar with our own sort of founding story and our history as an independent country. When you look back at 1965, as Singapore became an independent country, and you polled people and say, what do you know about Singapore? You would have heard, you know, about Singapore's ethnic strife. You would have heard about economic failure. You had heard about a very messy region. The US was still fighting the wars in Vietnam, that no one will pay that much attention to Singapore. Yet today, the role that we play has really been, how do you then defend your sovereignty and independence with that sort of all this noise going on? And public diplomacy is putting you up front in that conversation. And so that's why it's become particularly important for small countries like Singapore to rise above the din, to rise above what people think about us. And maybe some of you may think Singapore is a country that bans chewing gum. How do I get beyond that sound of Singapore banning chewing gum into everything else that we do? And so that is really the challenge, not just of the Singapore embassy in Washington, D.C., but many embassies that are here, particularly if you are like Singapore, not a squeaky wheel. And those of you who may have worked in government, you know that government attention goes to the urgent, not the important. So the urgent things are those squeaky wheels that need to be oiled, and Singapore's really not that. How do you get attention when you're not that squeaky wheel? When in many ways, and Washington, D.C. is quite different here on the Pacific coast. Washington, D.C. is still a very transatlantic world. They look at, you know, particularly now with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and everything is really framed in a transatlantic context. How does this country on the other side of the world, in the Asian continent, really get any attention? And that's really that challenge. And today, the conversations, when they are framed around Asia, is framed in the context of US-China competition. Not so much about Singapore or Southeast Asia. It's where do these countries fit in our competition with US-China relationships? So for what, and Singapore is known as the little red dot, because if you look at a map and you can't spot us, we're the little red dot at the bottom of the Asian continent. How does this little red dot on the other side of the world get any attention? And that's really that challenge that I face in Washington, D.C., that I've had to face over the past decade or so, and that many diplomats do face in Washington, D.C., because it is different for the big countries. If you are coming from a long-established partner of the US, you're coming from one of the major countries that are part of that long-term connection that Washington has. In many ways, as a new ambassador comes in, the red carpet is laid out for that new ambassador. You get attention straight away. Not so much for the smaller countries. How do we get attention for the administration, with Congress, with the think tank world, with the media, with social media today? How do we build the people-to-people ties? And that's really where countries like Singapore have to look at platforms for engagement. I am fortunate that Singapore has, from that early story of 1965 of ethnic strife and economic failure and regional conflict, the story of Singapore has transformed in over 50 years. We were very fortunate. In fact, our founding prime minister termed his own biography From Third World to First. So it's a good product to sell in many ways, and that makes my job a lot easier. But it comes with several fundamental pillars of the relationship. that I will try and outline. So that just in summary, first, of course, a very strong bilateral relationship built around defense and security. From the time of the US engagement in Vietnam, Singapore built up a very strong security relationship with the United States. The United States uses our naval and air-based facilities in Singapore. There's a 1990 Memorandum of Understanding that's been extended till 2035 and keeps allowing the US to continue facilities in Singapore. In parallel, we have signed agreements that allow us to use facilities, military facilities in the United States. Being a very small country that takes defense quite seriously, we have a national service for all our men at the age of 18. We buy high-tech equipment from the US and other countries. We do use facilities in the US. Across the world, across the country, we have F-16s based over here, F-15s based over here, Apache helicopters. We are buying the F-35s. So that very strong defense and security pillar becomes quite a fundamental part of that conversation as people try to understand where is Singapore in all these sort of role to play. The second pillar is really economic. In 2004, we concluded a free trade agreement with the United States. It was the US's first free trade agreement with an Asian country. And with that FTA, we've built up an economic relationship that today, Singapore is the hub of US investments in Asia. We have a population of 5.5 million, as I said, in a small little island at the bottom of the Asian continent. But there are more US investments in Singapore than there are in China, India, Japan, and Korea combined, which has a population of almost 3 billion. But because Singapore, with the FTA, has come up to US standards, IP standards, rule of law, that's really become a very important part of our diplomatic engagement. How do we sort of build on this economic frameworks to move forward? We did work with the US on Trans-Pacific Partnership. That one, of course, the US administration pulled out of it. But today we're working on new arrangements called the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework to make sure that we stay part of that conversation in terms of where the US looks out to the region, not just at Singapore, but the entire region. The third area, the third pillar that we work on in terms of the platform we engage on is regional and diplomatic, built around ASEAN. Now, Singapore, with 5.5 million people, would just be a little dot if we did not have a region of 600 million people with us. In Southeast Asia, in ASEAN, we have built a fairly effective regional organization, not like the EU, because it was never meant to be like the EU, one that pulls together people of different political, economic, social backgrounds, but one in which has become a pivotal center of US and other geopolitical interests in the region. Because Southeast Asia, between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, from the Straits of Malacca to the South China Sea, is really where all that global trade goes through. It is where global security goes through. It is so critical. So what we've tried to do with ASEAN, build an integrated ASEAN economy, work together diplomatically. I'm not saying it's the easiest organization to work with, and we can get into some of the details of the challenges within ASEAN itself, but it does become an important platform to engage with the administration, with Congress about ASEAN. There's a Partner ASEAN Act going through Congress today. There's an effective caucus on ASEAN in the region, but it helps build our own public diplomacy as Singapore to speak about where Singapore's place is within this ASEAN context. The next area is, I think, Singapore's hidden strengths. It's our food, and that always gets people interested in our public diplomacy. I know you're supposed to talk about serious things in public diplomacy, but food is an important part of our public diplomacy. It's culture. Those of you who watch Crazy Rich Asians, that did more for public diplomacy than all my efforts in over 10 years. We filled up 3 cinema halls with members of Congress because we were showing Crazy Rich Asians in 2018. That's important because that's where you get people in. That's where you get people focused on your region. Some of you here, some of the students here may have had to go through Singapore math. That's public diplomacy as well, because as our education system has become world-class, many US schools have started adopting Singapore math as something they teach. We have world-class institutions. Today, we're building up ideas around sustainability and climate for the future. And even through COVID, you know, everyone in many ways was comparing their own models with the Singapore model, how we dealt with COVID. There were a very low number of deaths. We had people trusting the government, trusting the messages that came out. If Singapore said the vaccine was fine, people trusted it. And we didn't try to hide or sugarcoat information. We put it out quite clearly. So that really helped in terms of where our public diplomacy was. Now, the audiences that we work with, the embassy works with, of course, is first and foremost the US. With all these areas of security, economic, diplomatic, it's really to maintain that relationship. So we're very cognizant of that. But we also work, there's also a message to the region. Because even as we're putting messages out here in the US, we must take into account the rest of the messages that we get out over there. For Singapore, it's really how do we rise above our ethnic and regional story? How do we get people in the region to understand that Singapore story? And public diplomacy is not just an external facing thing, it's also domestic. How do we explain to people why are we so closely engaged and aligned with the US? And, just a very quick case study, for example, and I'll finish with this sort of quick case study as you think about these issues. We're now coming up to the year after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and how that messaging, that public diplomacy became a very important part in these sort of three areas. Obviously, with the US, Singapore was one of the few countries that came out, put sanctions against Russia. We voted in the UN to criticize the Russians. But our message during the time of the Russian invasion of Ukraine was a little bit different from the message that many Western countries were doing. We didn't frame it as many Western countries do, as democracy versus autocracy. We framed it as multilateralism, as territorial integrity, of rules of the road, because as a small country, that's much more important to us than trying to get into a values conversation around democracy versus autocracy. So that was really one message, and our message around the Russian invasion was multilateralism. Let's use the UN. Let's resolve this issue. Let's criticize what we think is wrong, even as we put in place some of the sanctions. In the region, we had to deal with it quite differently as well, because not everyone in ASEAN necessarily took Singapore's position. ASEAN itself came out with a couple of statements about the Russian invasion without mentioning Russia. So they were concerned about the situation in Ukraine. Not all the ASEAN countries voted in the UN to criticize Russia. So there are differences within our region, and we had to, as a member of the region, reconcile these differences and explain some of these differences as we speak to different audiences. And there's also very much a domestic audience in Singapore that have to be dealt with, because the traditional expectation in Singapore is that this is not an issue that involves us. This is on the other side of the world. Let's keep our head down. Let's keep out of it. Why are we taking such a public position? And the Prime Minister down had to get out publicly to explain how these rules of multilateralism, territorial integrity are important for all small states. So it's really using public diplomacy in all three levels of that engagement. So not just what we did at the embassy, across the board to get that across. So that's really that framework of public diplomacy I wanted to sort of put out to you as Singapore does these things. And I'm happy to take any questions that you have. Thank you.
Great. Well, so Ambassador, thank you very much for those opening remarks. There were a number of things that you mentioned that we would like to delve into a little bit. Let me start though, maybe it's an easier one, on the second pillar you talked about, economic. So just for our audience to understand, I mean, you mentioned that Singapore became independent in 1965. And it really was under the leadership of Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew that Singapore is viewed as really an economic miracle. So in that last half century, the achievement of Singapore to emerge from a developing nation, and you express some of those elements, to a highly developed nation is remarkable. I mean, so remarkable that the population you mentioned, 5.5 million, just for context, Los Angeles has a population of about 4 million, just the city of Los Angeles, where we are right now. If you look at LA County, it's double the size of Singapore. So it is a small nation state. And it's about half the size in square miles of Los Angeles, 281 square miles by my count, and about 500 square miles for Los Angeles. So that context, but the GDP of Singapore is about $400 billion. Los Angeles GDP is about twice that, about 950. However, the GDP per capita in Singapore is about 130 or over $130,000. So that would rank it the second highest in the world in per capita GDP. Los Angeles's per capita GDP is about half of what Singapore is. So the success that you've witnessed is remarkable. The nation being, regarded as the world's most open economy, the most pro-business economy. You have the second largest, second busiest port of Singapore. I mean, we have a major port. Los Angeles port is the most active in the United States. So there's a lot of similarities in some respects, but this economic miracle in Singapore, my question for you is, how do you see that continuing? And are you seeing the GDP growth that you were expecting as you've now sort of recovered from the pandemic?
Thank you. Thank you. And to add to the challenges that Singapore faced, and you use the term miracle. I believe in hard work, so it was the hard work, but it also came with more constraints than most people understand and appreciate. Singapore has got no energy at all. We have to import all our energy. So not a drop of oil, no gas, no capacity for nuclear because we're too small to be nuclear. We just have to import everything. Yet we keep the lights on all the time.
Yes.
And infrastructure is so good that wafer fab companies, chip companies set up because they know the lights are not going to go out. So you've got zero energy. We have zero food. We have to import all our food from our neighbors. That becomes another challenge. How do you feed the population? Everything's got to be imported. And you cannot just bring it across the border from Malaysia because people want the diversity. And today we import food from around the world. We do have a plan now. COVID did give some rethinking about some of these food supply chains, that we have a 30 for 30 plan. By 2030, we want 30% of our food to be grown or done domestically. I use grown loosely because some of it may be cell-based food. Our food authority was the first one to approve cell-based meat, made in a lab. California technology coming to Singapore, and we're working with that. We're looking at urban gardens, but we've got to overcome this challenge of just not having enough food for our people. And the third constraint is water. We don't have enough water. We still have these long-term agreements with Malaysia that go until 2061 that allow us to buy water. Everyday raw water comes from Malaysia to Singapore, is processed and put into our water systems. We have used water then and this is again interesting for LA, we've now looked at the constraints of water and built up a whole industry around water. So we have recycled water, what you may call sewage water, but we recycle it. And those of you who visit Singapore, I'd encourage you to visit one of these plants because these are open for tourism. And when you finish the end of the tour, they'll give you a bottle of recycled water to drink. That's been sort of filtered through all the system, perfectly acceptable by WHO standards, that we put it over there. Nice. We have some desalination, but desalination is expensive, requires land, requires energy. So we've looked at our constraints and then risen above them, built new industries around them, built around how can we get some of these things going. Well, your question, Glenn, is really, how do you sustain this in the future? It was easy to get double-digit growth when you're starting from a very low base. And we started from such a low base in 1965. Today, we're coming up to developed countries status, and you're looking at 2 to 3% growth. That is really the reality of things. So then how do you get quality growth into it? How do you get more productive growth into it? It's not about throwing land into the solution or more labor into the solution. It is how do you get better value? How do you get better productivity for the inputs that you put in? So we work with US multinationals and other multinationals, particularly US multinationals, to move up the value chain. So a few years ago, I was invited to speak in Puerto Rico because they wanted to learn the Singapore economic model. How do we make it work? In fact, Puerto Rico started industrialization before Singapore. In the 1950s, there was a Harvard economist who came to Puerto Rico and said, open up, and you have pharmaceutical companies opening up in Puerto Rico and others. He then took that model to Singapore and said, why don't you move to industrialization in the 1960s, as we needed to have jobs for people? The difference between that model and what Singapore did is that if you go to Puerto Rico, you are still doing things the 1950s way. It hasn't moved up the value chain. What Singapore did is they said many of these industries, yes, we got jobs in the early stages for people in the 1960s and 70s. Then we need to move up the value chain. Let's relocate some of these industries to our neighbors. We set up industrial parks in Vietnam, in Indonesia, in Malaysia, to relocate some of these manufacturing activities, which are very land and labor intensive, but keep the much more brain intensive activities in Singapore. The R&Ds in Singapore, the IP protection is in Singapore. So we've moved up that value chain, and that may be some of the ways that we really have to continue our growth. Keep moving up the value chain, signing these free trade agreements as we have with the US, as with others, getting some of that connectivity going, making sure the world trading system works effectively. And that's where some of our biggest challenge is going to be. We grew in a world of globalization. We're now in a world where people are speaking about deglobalization, about decoupling. That will be difficult for small countries to sustain growth if we're in this deglobalized world. If you have to sort of certainly make choices because each choice ends up being less efficient than a globalized choice. But these are the challenges we face for the future.
Good, very good. Well, thank you for that perspective on the economic challenges and opportunities. But we're sitting here at the USC Center on Public Diplomacy. So I want to talk about diplomacy now. And in your opening remarks, you mentioned that much of diplomacy is framed around US-China relations. And it's difficult for us not to engage in that discussion because of just the recent situation where we see that the spy balloon incident has really been ratcheted up, and even over the weekend, it didn't seem like in Munich, when Secretary of State Blinken met with Wang Yi, that anything calmed down. I mean, it really maybe, if anything, intensified some of the pressure. But in Singapore's case, you have a slightly different relationship with China than the US. And I understand that the Foreign Affairs Minister, Vivian Balakrishnan, just completed a 3-day visit to Beijing with his counterpart, Foreign Minister Qin Gang. And he characterized the meeting as smooth. There's a code of conduct agreement underway that the free trade agreement for China and ASEAN nations is being negotiated and updated. It was his 5th visit to China since the pandemic began. And he even went so far as to say that the pandemic deepened the reservoir of goodwill and trust between Singapore and China. And so my question to you is, how does Singapore maintain such good relations with China while also maintaining strong ties with the US when the US is trying to put pressure on nations to sort of, well, let's say, counter the China influence? How do you navigate that area?
Very carefully. Look at this line over here. We're walking this line, and that's where my framing about the conversation about US-China comes in.
Yes.
Because it would, from a public diplomacy or diplomacy point of view, I would prefer if Washington saw Southeast Asia and Singapore for what it is. It is the center of US engagement with the region, not because of US-China relations. I understand completely the geopolitical contest between the US and China. Great powers will have this, and it's emerged more and more in the 11 years that I have been in Washington, DC, much more of that geopolitical competition. But the countries of the region, Singapore included, and many other countries, even many Western countries, all need to maintain a relationship with China as well, as does the US. There is a significant amount of economic interdependence between the US and China. Even as measures are put in place, export controls are put in place, you see that the trade balance still goes up between the US and China. That economic interdependence is also relevant to all the countries of the rest of the world, where countries have to sell into China and countries have to buy out of China. So what we'd like is for the US to look at Southeast Asia for how important Southeast Asia is. There are 600 million people in Southeast Asia. That's not a small number. It's double the size of the US population. It's half the size of China's population, many on the cusp of middle class. So don't look at Southeast Asia only in the framework of US-China relations. But let me address your question about Singapore's relationship with China, because the foreign minister did have a very successful visit to Beijing this week. The new Chinese foreign minister used to be China's ambassador to Washington, D.C. So I knew him well when he was in Washington. Very suave gentleman, settling into his role. In fact, after my foreign minister was in Beijing, he flew out to Jakarta and met the Indonesian foreign minister, because Indonesia is currently the chair of ASEAN. So China will run their relationships with the region somewhat separately from their relationship with the US. That US relationship is going to be challenging and contentious. Accusations of spy balloons or accusations of poor trust, miscommunication. This has become part of the US-China relationship. Concerns over potential conflict, concerns about, Secretary Blinken did speak about concerns that China may think of providing lethal equipment to Russia in the war against Ukraine. So all of these things worry the region. But for Singapore, what are the priorities for us? Obviously, to get trade and economic relationship back. During COVID, because China was shut down, people from China couldn't travel to Singapore, people from Singapore couldn't travel to China. We're only about 10% of the flights we used to have pre-COVID between Singapore and China. Whereas I compare that with the US, Singapore Airlines has put in more flights between the US and Singapore than even before COVID. So there's more capacity now from LA, from San Francisco, from Seattle, from JFK, from Newark, from Houston into Singapore than there was before COVID. So China's got to come back into some new equilibrium of travel. We've got to get our economic relationship back on stream again. On the code of conduct, discussing within ASEAN, how do we deal with these issues? Because ASEAN is negotiating with the Southeast Asian countries, are negotiating with China over a code of conduct for the South China Sea. These are important issues that we need to discuss, even as US-China relations remain uncertain. So the region has to continue the engagement with China. We want there to be some stability in US-China relations. So it concerns us if there is no proper engagement. It is good that Secretary Blinken met Wang Yi last weekend. The messaging was not very positive, but diplomacy is meeting people. You have to get out over there. You just have to engage with people. There will be differences, there will be lack of trust, there will be disagreements, but that's really part of that process. So I hope that that meeting that Tony Blinken and Wang Yi had last weekend will lead to more engagement. Not that it's going to lead to more trust, but more engagement, that they can then find there are global issues that have to be resolved between the two of them. But then the rest of us have to find our space in this conversation.
Yes, well, I think that's very well said, particularly from someone from Singapore. I can understand that perspective, and from a diplomacy standpoint, to be able to have that engagement certainly is important, because in order to advance to another step and another step, it does need to exist. Let's see, I'm going to go to one of the questions that came in advance, then we'll open it up to some questions from the audience here. I have a number of other questions that I want to get to, but I don't want it to be all about my questions. This question came in from the audience, and it has more to do with the investments. You had mentioned something about the U.S. has more investment in Singapore than in
China, Japan, India, Korea combined. Yes.
That's remarkable.
Yeah. I'm surprised every time I say that figure. I say, please check it again. And they check it, and it's always correct.
Okay. There's one investment that this person has posed the question, and that's regarding crypto. So the question is, with the collapse of FTX, will Singapore reconsider its investments in crypto as its uses of citizens' money in general? And this audience is probably very familiar with crypto.com, because that Singapore-based organization took on the naming rights of our beloved Staples Center just downtown, where our Lakers and Clippers play, I think in the tune of $700 million. crypto.com, now called the crypto.com arena or the crypt. But the question is about crypto in general. And what are your thoughts about that within Singapore's investment strategy?
Well, let me speak about
Exchange.
fintech in Singapore, because that's where some of the regulatory frameworks come in. In many ways, as fintech emerged, many people wanted to get involved in that. The Singapore approach was we let fintech comes in. In fact, we do the world's largest fintech festival that takes place in November every year, which brings in new ideas around fintech. It doesn't just mean crypto, it is everything around the technology. There's ideas across the whole range of fintech. Yeah. The difference in Singapore was that we didn't want to pre-regulate them or use existing regulation for them. We created sandboxes for them to experiment with these things, but they were not available to the public. The moment they wanted to sell to the public, that's where the regulatory authorities then had to assess this in the context of, do you want to put these things out to the public without some of the safety? Because as banks do, when banks offer products to an investor, banks have certain responsibilities and we wanted them. So I think that not all the fintech and crypto companies met the regulatory requirements. It's quite different if you're going to a small group of investors and saying, this is it, and you know the risk. But if you're putting it out to the general public, we took a much more careful stand. So we have seen, in fact, many of these crypto companies that were in Singapore starting to leave or relocate. So that's really our approach. Now, on the specifics of crypto, I'm not sure what the context of that question may be. That's,
okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let me see if there are questions from the audience. I'm going to take one or two right now.
This lady over there.
Yes. And I'll have to, since you're not mic'd, I'll just repeat your question before the ambassador.
Speak loudly, maybe that will help. But hi, my name's Jenny Hunkin. I'm a student here at USC in the Masters of Public Diplomacy program. And I was wondering if you could speak to the role that you find education plays in Singapore's public diplomacy. You spoke about I think that's obviously a very positive part of Singapore's reputation, but specifically within the US-Singapore context of what role that plays with the closure of certain institutions like Yale or NUS Yale, and sort of where you see the future of education in US and Singapore relations.
Thank you. And that question came from Jenny Hunkin, a student, about education and the role of Singapore and the US in that education space, basically. I'm not sure if the audience could hear that question, but Ambassador.
Education is a very important part of how Singapore is viewed, because we have invested a significant amount of effort to get our students ready for the world. So the PISA tests, which are used internationally, has Singapore students at the top. We make sure that most students have some fluency in English, math, and science. That's a critical part of it. I did mention Singapore Math, which is being used in some high schools over here to teach the kids. And then we've developed world-class universities and institutions. The National University of Singapore, depending which ranking you use, is in the top 20 or top 25. The Nanyang Technological University, one of the newer universities, Singapore Management University. Each one of those have developed a strong relationship to a point that many US institutions are comfortable sending their students on exchange programs to Singapore institutions because it's English speaking. The credits can easily be transferred. Many Singapore institutions send students overseas on exchange programs, and many of them do come to US institutions. That's one part of that diplomacy that engages people in that conversation. We do have scholarships, summer scholarships for US undergraduates to apply to go to Singapore to spend a summer in Singapore. Again, that's one way of doing it. On the Yale NUS, it's really a movement of, we started a liberal arts school with Yale several years ago. It's a movement of that school to something that comes entirely within the National University of Singapore, as they've developed that confidence to run their own institution for liberal arts. So it has been one part of that cooperation. There have been others we've done before. We've done some with MIT that have also, many of these come, they work through a certain period, and then the university itself takes over and running them. You learn from others. We don't claim to have all the best knowledge, but then you take these and move these forward in our own direction.
Thank you. And just for this audience, just from a context standpoint here at USC, we have about 50 undergraduate students from Singapore and about 30 graduate students.
Okay.
So about 80. For a small-ish population, that's actually a very good number, not.
Probably have quotas, we probably could send you more undergraduate students, but your quotas stop our students from coming in.
Well, please do. We have some very high quality students. And I know that we also have many programs that
Mhm.
go to Singapore. In fact, I think I saw a colleague sitting in the back there, Chow from Marshall, is taking a group of 70 or 80 students to Singapore during spring break. So in a couple weeks, we'll be doing that. I see a lot of hands.
Marie there.
I'm going to go to Murray first.
Well,
Yes.
thank you very much. And first of all, I want to say, Ambassador, thank you so much for coming to USC to speak with us today. You mentioned the importance of meeting people, and you just talked a little bit about public diplomacy and exchanges. I know that you're one of our most esteemed examples of alumnus of the International Business Leadership Program, where you came at a younger age representing Singapore to the United States. I wanted to ask you what that experience was like, what did you do, and what did you learn about public diplomacy?
Well, first I credit the US Department of State for keeping a record of this. When Marie was Assistant Secretary in the Department of State, they did, was 50 years of the IVLP?
It was actually 80.
80.
When you came, you were my kickoff speaker for the 80th anniversary.
80th
Wow.
anniversary.
Program. And
Yeah.
you spoke at State Department in January of 2020.
Okay, so you have a good memory, and first you have good records that some random junior diplomat from Singapore is invited to come here to the United States. I think I spent a month in the US, spending time in Washington, going out. I went to New Orleans, I went to Nebraska. I have the key to the city of Lincoln. I came to San Francisco, I went to Hawaii. It was a very good
Wow.
program designed for people who didn't have any educational experience in the US. They had not studied in the US, but I was working on the region, and it was a good way to, so it was really a excellent way for the US to reach out to potential people. And I'm probably one of the least relevant people in the IVLP. You had Margaret Thatcher.
Yeah.
I remember a whole series. Yes, you had a whole series of people who had been selected by their embassies around the world in order to come and spend time in the US. So I think that's an important part of it, because you do connect, you start to see, in the 1990s when I came, this was almost pre-internet days. So your only information about US may be reading newspapers, articles, that's all you get. You're suddenly there, you're talking to people, you're exchanging the whole world of diplomacy. So I credit the US for being able to do that. And in fact, we have copied some of these programs in Singapore as well to take people from around the world, to bring them to Singapore so that they have an opportunity to engage people at fairly young age, but you know that they have a potential to be key personalities in the relationship. So thank you for that.
Great. I'll take a question. Yeah, the gentleman on the right. I think your hand went up before yours, so I'll get you out. Yes,
Thank you, Ambassador.
Michael.
I'm a communications undergraduate, and I'm from Singapore.
Oh, good.
And I intend to work in the government sector after I graduate. So like public diplomacy is really important to apply my education. So this is an incredible opportunity. So I just want to say that I think you did a great job of framing, and I guess for lack of a better word, selling the Singapore story. I just would like to turn attention to maybe like the domestic diplomacy side of things, and because like for many Singaporeans, we may not see ourselves as exceptional in the numbers and KPIs that are humanize the everyday challenges Singaporeans go through. Maybe it's a political problem. But so I want to ask, perhaps to what extent is acknowledging the downsides and the concessions that came about within the Singapore story a part of public diplomacy? And I guess the second related question is how do you nurture domestic confidence in the Singapore identity, our place internationally, and how we do things properly? Thank you.
So the question around the downsides of the Singapore story.
Yes, and
Okay.
like do you do that as part of your job and like
Mhm.
how do you navigate?
Framing, the positioning.
Yeah. You know, Singapore, any country, you have to accept it warts and all. And as a diplomat who's lived in very many different countries, each country promotes their success stories, but is also aware of their own less successful stories as well. And so if you ask the average man in the street here in LA, they will have a very different framing of the United States from one that I have, where I see the US as a global leader, a critical partner in global leadership issues. But man in the street may say, why are we spending so much money on Ukraine? How do you make that case? And similarly in Singapore, you've got to see it. We are a dramatically successful society, but it does come with certain challenges. And I think that as each government reacts to the challenges and you deal with them as you go ahead. And so that's really how you've got to manage it, not apologizing for them, but really dealing with it. And that really becomes framing to your question around the Singapore identity. What is the Singapore identity? Is it just the food we get together to eat? Is it how we've put this whole framing together of a country that unlikely to succeed became successful, that within that framework of success looks after a broad range of the society, a society where, we have, for example, and you would have served in the military as well, all Singapore men at the age of 18 go in the military for 2 years. That helps build some of our identity because we pull people together of different races, of different backgrounds to come together. Is it our public housing projects? Those of you who are not familiar with our public housing, that 80% of our people own their own homes, living in very decent public housing. Is it our food? Because, for example, UNESCO has recognized the Singapore food courts as a UNESCO heritage, because that's where we all go and sit together, despite our backgrounds, despite our, every food is available. And UNESCO recognizes that. So all these things frame a Singapore identity. And then you've got to decide how do you put this out to a public audience, both international, but I did emphasize as well, you have to make these messages known to domestic audiences. And domestic audiences tend sometimes to, again, it's not unique to Singapore, as I said, I've lived in many countries, and there's lots of anecdotes told about speaking to taxi drivers, but I do find speaking to taxi drivers everywhere gives you a better sense of, how they get a sense of their own future or their own family's future, because these are hardworking, striving people. Whether you get in a taxi in New York or a taxi in Jakarta or a taxi in Singapore, you ask the taxi driver how they see their future. And I will not be surprised if you find that a taxi driver in Singapore grumbles about everything, but has children in PhD programs in biotechnology somewhere, or so you're not doing too badly. So that's really how we frame it.
Well, and I have to say that I just adore the hawker centers, the food in Singapore. I had the benefit of being able to travel there many, many times while I was based in Asia, and it was certainly a highlight. I love chili crab as well. I'll take this question here, and then I'll go to yes.
Thank you so much for being here and writing up the whole story. In fact, the book that you recommended, was the first is recommended for us from India who's invested in seeing a developed country or a higher income country. I want to understand from you, is there a difference in Singapore's public diplomacy towards the US/West as opposed to the global South? And what differences are these? And somewhere we are grappling, discussing, debating, how do we evaluate good public diplomacy? Can you share your thoughts on how, in your view, we could define day-to-day goals as good public diplomacy?
Each one of your questions requires a whole thesis, First on the book, Third World to First, I'm glad it's being read, but one thing that we do say in Singapore is that model is unique to Singapore.
Yeah.
Many countries want to learn because Singapore's unique history, identity, it's really unique to Singapore, a small country. I mean, with India, we have a very close relationship. Prime Minister Modi has said that there are things that India can learn from Singapore. We're very clear on the fact that a small dot of an island, as you said, LA is larger, has really very few lessons for different countries, which are dramatically different challenges, dramatically different geographies and histories. But where we can help and what Singapore has done as part of, you may call it public diplomacy, we call it technical cooperation. We invite people from the global south, from around the world, particularly Southeast Asia, to come and learn in Singapore. We have a very active, what we call a technical cooperation program. Some of these we partner with developed countries. We have a partnership with the US, with Japan, with the World Bank, with the IMF. It brings people from around the world to Singapore to spend time understanding and learning about different parts of how that Singapore model may potentially work. It's not the whole model. So you want to learn about an airport, our Singapore Aviation Academy will get you to come to Singapore. You learn how to run an airport. We have a maritime academy that teaches you how to run a port. We are very focused with dealing with countries in the Caribbean and the Pacific around climate change, given the challenges they face around climate change. So we're very cognizant of the fact we work with the Commonwealth countries to come to Singapore to learn because they have similar bureaucratic systems as we have. Most of our priorities, obviously, with ASEAN, with our neighbors in Southeast Asia, and many of them come and learn investment, trade facilitation. They learn about cybersecurity, humanitarian assistance. We have a whole suite of programs available to people and obviously targeted to the global south. We also, Singapore uniquely, while we are, we work closely with many countries in the West, in the East, around the world, we've also championed the cause of small countries. 31 years ago, we just celebrated the 30th year last year. In New York, we set up the Forum of Small States that our ambassador in New York manages. Small countries, India is very big, but it is the smaller countries, 5 to 10 million population. How do we get a louder voice in organizations like the UN, which is dominated by the Security Council and the permanent members of the Security Council, who are never going to accept a change of that? So how does this Forum of Small States get a voice into that? When the G20 got set up in the 2000s, Singapore is not a G20 member because we don't reach that number of GDP. So we set up an organization called the Global Governance Group, the 3G Group, and every year we provide inputs to the G20. And again, in the Global Governance Group, it's smaller countries that need to have a voice because you cannot just run global issues on the top 20 largest economies. So every year, my prime minister gets invited to the G20 meeting that India will be hosting this year. He's been invited by Prime Minister Modi to attend the G20 meeting. We work with smaller countries, the Association of Small Island States, around climate change issues. So we are focused very much on across the board, a whole range of diplomacy that is important to us. Obviously, the one that gets the most attention is our relationship with China or India or the United States, but there is a whole range of diplomacy that we work around. That takes a lot of effort, but we think that's very valuable and important for us. Thank you.
Great. Let's see. There's
There's
a
a question over here.
there's a couple questions that have come in
Okay.
online, and I just don't want our audience that's watching remotely to think that I've forgotten them. One of the questions is rather specific, and I think we'll skip it because it has to deal with differences between the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership and the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. But that maybe is something.
One has the US, one does not have the US.
Yes.
I would wish the US did more economically with the region. That's my quick summary of.
Okay. So I'm going to go, the question is from Brian Bernards, who thanks you for your reflections and wisdom today. He says that you mentioned the need of the US to engage directly with ASEAN on issues of relevant interest, rather than always in regard to US-China relations, which we talked about earlier. You also mentioned the role of popular culture, like Crazy Rich Asians, which my aside is that was directed by John Chu, a distinguished alum of the USC School of Cinematic Arts. So shout out to John Chu. So if you take those two, the popular culture in raising Singapore's profile, as well as the US engaging directly with ASEAN, the question is if there are any current cultural oriented initiatives that Singapore is involved in with ASEAN to help raise awareness on the global stage, not only of Singapore's profile, but Southeast Asia in general.
Well, since we're in LA, on Crazy Rich Asians, it was my one and only opportunity to walk the red carpet. So it's really quite different walking the red carpet. So I think I'm not so sure. So sort of having the Singapore ambassador walk the red carpet for the Singapore movie, that was a unique opportunity to be able to do that. I think it's important that ASEAN does a lot more to get global attention. The ASEAN foreign ministers, in fact, have said we should bid for a joint soccer World Cup. And the next World Cup, in fact, LA will be host of some of the games over here in 2026. That's being shared with Mexico and Canada.
Yeah.
You know, how can we get a World Cup, soccer World Cup that really has a few capitals in Southeast Asia, Thailand included, to sort of host some of the games? You know, I think these sorts of things can raise some of the profile of Southeast Asia. Otherwise, getting the popular culture, the sort of Southeast Asian culture within the US is really individual singers, performers who get out over there. People from Thailand or Philippines or South Singapore. And then you look at their backgrounds, many of them do have a Southeast Asian background, but it's really breaking into some of the bigger markets.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to go to our visiting scholar, Matthew Asada. Matthew, if you could just introduce yourself and your question.
My name is Matthew Asada. I'm a Foreign Service Officer with the Department of State. I'm on detail here at the center for 2 years. And I'm actually teaching and researching on global mega events. So like the World Cup, I was in Doha. But my most recent
That's a good job you have.
Yeah, if you can get it. Yeah.
Okay.
And so I was in charge of the USA Pavilion at Expo 2020. And I actually have to give a commendation to your country for your representation at Expo 2020. Your pavilion there, it won one of the awards for architecture. Fantastic, talking about the urban jungle. It's actually motivated me to visit Singapore. So my alma mater is hosting a education alumni conference, and I'll be going to Singapore in a couple of weeks, flying out here Singapore Air. But my question is a little bit about, these big events and branding. And so you mentioned like, a joint bid for the World Cup. But with your service as the ambassador in Washington for the last 10, 11 years, you've seen quite a number of things, but probably the most significant branding event for Singapore in a geopolitical sense may have been the Singapore Summit. President Trump in North Korea. You were obviously in Washington at that time. And I'm curious if you can tell us a little bit about how your perspective on how the event came together, maybe something about what it meant for Singapore to host this, and just in the role of being more engaged in multilateral, or it's hosting some of these events, and whether you see, another Security Council seat in Singapore's future as a non-permanent member.
Okay. Again, first on global events like, the expo that Dubai did, or large sporting events. For countries like Singapore, we're fairly careful about doing these things because we just don't have the space. I don't think we could ever host an Olympics in Singapore. Just don't have, some of the things we do. We did the Youth Olympics, the first ever Youth Olympics, let me just a second, in 2010 or 2011. So young people, 6,000, limited number come in, and that gets you some attention. We do the F1 in Singapore every September. That's very popular. Became more popular because it's a night race, and it was the first ever night race of the F1. So you've got to be fairly careful how you do this, because you interest some people, but you can irritate some people as well. The F1, for example, shuts down the center of Singapore for a week, and your cars cannot go through, and the shopping malls are complaining, how come people can't drive up to my shopping mall? You've got to get the right balance of what is good and what is not good. You cannot bid for everything. So that is where we, yes, some things get you that global brand, but you don't overextend yourself. Some multilateral meetings happen over just regularly. Singapore every 10 years will hold an ASEAN meeting. Singapore will host regularly an APEC meeting. We do these things, and it becomes a place to showcase Singapore for the world. On the Security Council, I'll come to the Kim-Trump summit finally. On the Security Council, I think we were on Security Council maybe in 2000. It's hard. Bids are hard. Countries fail. It is a complicated process. Maybe we'll do it. I don't know whether we'll do it. It took quite a lot of effort, because considering the time zone of New York and Singapore, you've got to make decisions in New York time, which is the middle of the night in Singapore. And that is difficult. We had to dedicate we're not like the US. We don't have that many diplomats. For example, by comparison, the US maybe has 170, 180 embassies around the world. We have about 30, because this is a people-intensive job. So we're fairly careful how we set up embassies in the Western Hemisphere. Aside from the embassy in Washington, we have the permanent representative in New York, and then we're one embassy in Brasilia. That's it. And so we're fairly careful how we overextend ourselves diplomatically. If there is certain value, yes, we may rebid for a Security Council seat, but it will take a lot of time and effort. The Trump-Kim summit was interesting because we didn't ask for it. I was in Washington, but President Trump decided on Singapore. I think he wanted to showcase to Kim Jong-un that if you give up your nuclear weapons, if you get on the path of peace, this is a potential that you can. I told you guys a Singapore story. He may have sort of thought that this is a way to do it. And obviously, because US leaders are so familiar with Singapore and US security is so familiar with Singapore, it was easy for us to run that conference. It did give us, you know, there is a term in communications, earned sort of attention, you know, whatever it was. And I think we spent about $20 million for security. I think the global audience that we got must have been worth several $100 billion.
Yeah.
Because every TV camera was focused on that meeting.
Yeah.
The Capella Hotel where President Trump and Chairman Kim met. Again, we didn't pick the hotel, the US and the Koreans picked the hotel. That suddenly their rates went up. Everyone wanted to eat the menu they had for lunch. And so you should try to visit when you do go to Singapore. I think there's a little plaque over there that commemorates it. Yeah, but you know, these are important events. I think what was important with Singapore, there was a trust that we could do it. There was a trust that we could do it at short notice, that security will be taken care of, not just for the US, for the North Koreans as well. You know, the North Koreans are a little bit, they do have an embassy in Singapore, but they had to be convinced that this was the place they wanted to do it. In fact, my foreign minister at that time happened to be in Washington, then said, I better go to Pyongyang to show that we're treating them equally, we're treating them with respect as they come to Singapore. So everything that we offer to the Americans, we offer to the North Koreans as well. And so people saw that balance in how we manage that relationship. I'm not sure whether we want to do another summit like that. I went back to that. It was challenging, but again, people in Singapore didn't really complain because we didn't have to shut the whole city down. Shut down parts as the convoys moved back and forth. But you know, things went on. Chairman Kim was able to visit a shopping mall one evening. And so if you look at photographs of him visiting one of the malls. And I think it was good to showcase that this can be part of the North Korean story once they decide to move forward.
Well, Ambassador, I'm sorry to say that we've reached the end of our time. I think we could certainly have continued. I have pages of notes and more questions. And I'm sure others have, but we want to be respectful of your time. I know that you have some other activities here on campus today. But I just did want to thank you on behalf of the university and our Center on Public Diplomacy for your talk today. You know, you started and you commented that public diplomacy is about open communications and communicating effectively. And I can certainly see that you adhere to your own words. And so thank you for your open communications with us today. We really enjoyed the time. And thank you to everybody who joined online and to our audience.
Thank you. Thank you.
There you go. Good.